Tell me if this could possibly be a coincidence. Out of the more than 4,000 cities in the world, there is only one city that has been the subject of dozens of United Nations resolutions. And it is the same city that is also the subject of dozens of Bible prophecies. I'm no mathematician, but the probability of that happening by accidental coincidence must be somewhere near zero, especially when you consider that those ancient prophecies and the modern UN resolutions talk about the very same issue. In case you haven't guessed it already, the city is Jerusalem. And the Bible is not full of prophecies about Athens, Rome, London, Beijing, or Istanbul, only Jerusalem. And the United Nations has not made dozens of resolutions about Moscow, Paris, Washington, Tokyo, or Mexico City, only Jerusalem. The prophecies, written around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, deal with the question of who would control Jerusalem in the distant future. And now, in that distant future, 2,000 to 3,000 years later, the United Nations resolutions deal with who should control Jerusalem. Could this be a mere chance coincidence? Or could it be part of the Bible's sign that earth-shaking events are about to occur, events that will affect the eternal destiny of everyone on this planet? The chances of this being coincidental diminishes to the point of vanishing when you consider the exact content of the Bible prophecies and the UN resolutions. The ancient prophetic writings speak about whether Jerusalem would be controlled centuries later by Jews or non-Jews. And the resolutions passed by the modern UN body speak about the exact same thing, whether Jews or non-Jews should control Jerusalem. Also significant is the fact that it almost never happens that a nation is denied control of its own capital city, and yet that is what the UN resolutions call for in regard to Jerusalem. The very first of these resolutions by the United Nations was passed in November 1947. It's Resolution 181, and it says, "The city of Jerusalem shall be established as a corpus separatum under a special international regime and shall be administered by the United Nations." So that portion of UN Resolution 181 calls for the city of Jerusalem to be administered by the United Nations. Jerusalem would not have a local governor or a local government of any sort, but it would be run by the UN. That in itself is highly unusual, unique among all the cities of the world, and that this particular city should be governed by the United Nations instead of being governed locally. And this UN Resolution 181 of 1947 remains in force as official international law. Other resolutions passed down through the years repeatedly refer to this one as still being in effect. The list of UN resolutions on Jerusalem goes on, and they keep referring back to that 1947 Resolution 181, keeping it in force. For example, toward the end of the year 2002, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 57/111 on Jerusalem, which states that the international community, through the United Nations, has a legitimate interest in the question of the city of Jerusalem. Any actions taken by Israel to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration on the holy city of Jerusalem are illegal and therefore null and void and have no validity whatsoever. And again, 14 years later, this 2016 General Assembly resolution begins by saying, recalling its Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947, and then it goes on to reiterate provisions of that resolution. So the UN still regards it as international law that Jerusalem should be under United Nations control, not controlled by the Jews as the capital of the State of Israel. There is no other city on earth that is the subject of dozens of UN resolutions, only Jerusalem. And there is no other city on earth that is the subject of dozens of Bible prophecies, only Jerusalem. And those prophecies focus on who will control the city. One example is in the Old Testament prophecies of Joel, where God speaks about the Gentile nations dividing up the land of Israel, and where God says, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land." So that prophecy says that God will enter into judgment against the nations that divided up the promised land. And today, dozens of United Nations resolutions on Jerusalem and the promised land deal with how that land should be divided up. How does history tell us that the promised land got divided up in the first place? And what led to the highly unusual situation, the unique situation among all the cities of the world, that the United Nations got involved in dividing up the promised land and trying to control the city of Jerusalem? In the New Testament, Jesus spoke prophetically about Jerusalem on more than one occasion. In the 13th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus talks about Jerusalem's temple being left desolate and says that then Christ himself would return to Jerusalem at a much later time, long after his death and resurrection, when the city would welcome him back. Jesus said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, just as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not have it. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. And I say to you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So Jerusalem would see Jesus again, but only when they would be ready to welcome him as being sent by God. But first, Jesus said Jerusalem would be destroyed. Its temple would be desolated. Its remaining population would be taken away captive, and the city would be trampled on by foreigners for an extended period of time. At Luke 21:24, after saying, "They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations," Christ went on to say, "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So Jesus gave a prophecy about the city of Jerusalem, saying that it would be controlled not by Jews, but by the Gentiles, until a certain time in the future when Gentile control of Jerusalem would come to an end. So how did this highly unusual situation come about? Historically, Israelite King David captured Jerusalem and made it the capital of Israel around 1,000 years before Christ. And Jewish kings ruled the promised land from that city as their capital and their seat of government for around 500 years. Then there was a 70-year captivity when most of the Jewish population was taken captive to Babylon, after which the Persian Empire defeated Babylon and sent the Jews back home to rebuild Jerusalem. From that time until Christ, Jerusalem was a Jewish city, but was under foreign occupation and control, first by the Persians, then by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and then by the Roman Empire, which is why Pontius Pilate sat as the Roman governor in Jerusalem when Christ was crucified. But way back at the beginning of their nation, God had told the Israelites that he would bless them if they obeyed him, and would punish them if they disobeyed. And the ultimate punishment was that they would lose their land and would be scattered worldwide to live as outcasts among all the other nations. So we read at Deuteronomy 28:64, "Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other." And in the Gospel of Luke, our Lord Jesus referred to Old Testament prophecy when he foretold what was going to happen to that generation of Jews in Israel. In Luke chapter 21, Jesus said that prophecy of Deuteronomy was about to be fulfilled when he said, "For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations." And within that generation, it happened, just as Jesus had said, and just as the earlier Old Testament prophecy had predicted. The armies of the Roman Empire killed 1,000,000 Jews and took the rest as prisoners to all the nations. The Jews remained in that scattered condition for almost 2,000 years. Even the Jews' existence in that scattered condition proved prophecy true. Over 300 years ago, King Louis XIV of France asked the philosopher Blaise Pascal to give him a proof of God. Pascal answered, "Why, the Jews, your majesty, the Jews." The existence of the God of the Bible was proved, Pascal said, by the presence of Jews in all the nations, carrying with them their scrolls in Hebrew, with their history of their ancient nation and how it got destroyed thousands of years earlier. The presence of these Jews in all the nations testified to the truth of the Holy Scriptures. But the Bible did not say they would remain scattered forever. Deuteronomy chapter 30 foretold a time when God would regather the scattered Jews from all the nations where they were spread abroad and would restore them to the promised land. Deuteronomy 30, beginning at verse 3, says, "Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you, even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens. From there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your fathers, and you will take possession of it." And that same prophecy of the restoration of Israel was repeated multiple times as a guarantee. Isaiah promised that God would gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Ezekiel told of a time in the distant future when the promised land would be filled with Jews who, after many days in future years, were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been left desolate. And that's the fulfillment of prophecy that occurred in 1948. The nation of Israel, which had been out of existence for a couple of thousand years, came back into existence in 1948. What about the city of Jerusalem? After Jesus said, "They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations," he went on to say, "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." As commemorated here in the Arch of Titus, the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem's temple, killed 1,000,000 Jews, and took the rest captive as prisoners, and sold them as slaves in all the nations. But Jesus' prophecy about the city of Jerusalem was that it would be controlled not by Jews, but by the Gentiles, that it would be trampled on by the Gentiles only until a certain time in the future, when Gentile control of Jerusalem would come to an end, and when the Jews would control the city again. History tells us that Jerusalem was trampled on by the Gentiles for a very long time. The Romans ruled Jerusalem for 500 years, and then as North Africa and the Middle East were taken over by Muslim invaders, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in the year 637. The Islamic Empire of the Ottoman Turks held on to Jerusalem until 1917, when the British captured the city during the First World War. The British were Gentiles, so the city was still trampled on by the Gentiles. The British occupation ended in 1948, followed immediately by war between the brand new state of Israel and all its Arab neighbors. But that war ended with the old city of Jerusalem still in Arab hands, so it was still being trampled on by the Gentiles. Then in another war in 1967, Israeli armies took the old city of Jerusalem away from the Gentile Arabs. As Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And that trampling by the Gentiles ended in 1967, when the Gentiles lost control of Jerusalem and it went back into Jewish hands. Still, the United Nations resolutions continue to demand that Jerusalem be under Gentile control. So all of this is not coincidental. It's no coincidence that Jerusalem is the only city on earth that has been the subject of dozens of United Nations resolutions and dozens of Bible prophecies. The modern-day fulfillment of those prophecies relates to the United Nations resolutions. The United Nations resolutions dividing up the Promised Land are fulfillments of Bible prophecy. But prophecy makes clear that there is more to happen. As we saw earlier, God says, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and will enter into judgment with them, because they have divided up my land." The United Nations resolutions to divide up the promised land are offensive to God, and he says he will do something about it. The prophecy is found in Zechariah chapter 12. In fact, this prophecy is being fulfilled right now as we speak. The first verse begins by saying, "This is the word of the Lord concerning Israel." Then he says, "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling." And that has been happening for decades. Recent history confirms how modern Israel has repeatedly defeated the surrounding Arab nations, despite being outnumbered and outgunned by Israel's enemies. In the next verse, Zechariah's prophecy also fits the scenario of modern times, with the United Nations passing the resolutions that we've been discussing. There, God says, "On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." At this time, right now, all the nations of the earth are gathered together against Jerusalem at the United Nations. For example, when the General Assembly met in 2002 and passed Resolution 57/111 on Jerusalem, the vote was 154 nations in favor of that resolution, with just 5 opposed and 6 abstaining. The nations of the earth voted overwhelmingly against Jerusalem being under Jewish control. And all the nations of the earth continue to meet at the United Nations, passing resolutions against a Jewish Jerusalem. They've been doing that ever since 1947, when that Resolution 181 declared the city of Jerusalem shall be administered by the United Nations. Over the years since then, the nations of the earth have united and been gathered together at the United Nations headquarters to pass more resolutions on Jerusalem than on any other city on the earth. A coincidence or fulfillment of Bible prophecy? Other translations render Zechariah 12:3 to say Jerusalem would be a heavy burden for all the nations. Like a heavy rock, anyone who tries to move it will get hurt. Jerusalem is a burden, a problem for the whole world, like a heavy rock that's in the way that no one can move. This is going on right now, and it's a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Jerusalem is a problem for the whole world because the non-Jewish nations are united against Jerusalem. They are furious that they lost control of Jerusalem, that they can no longer trample on Jerusalem. As Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The end of Gentile trampling on Jerusalem when the city fell back into Jewish hands in 1967, that's one of the foretold end times events that Jesus told us to watch for. Just 4 verses after saying that Gentile control of Jerusalem would end, Jesus said, "When these things begin to happen, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." As we obey Jesus' command to keep watch for his return, the events involving Jerusalem are among those we need to watch. I'm talking about current events, things happening in this week's news and in next week's news, things that we need to keep track of if we're watching for Christ's return, keeping watch as he told us to. Big things are about to happen, and current events will culminate in the glorious return of Christ. It's no coincidence that these things are happening in the world today. As we continue to watch the foretold events unfold, we can lift up our heads and rejoice as we pray, "Come, Lord Jesus." These live-streamed services are aimed at providing traditional worship services for believers who otherwise would not have them because they're confined to the home or because they don't have a nearby church that sings traditional hymns and preaches Bible messages. And these services are also aimed at reaching the world with messages proclaiming and upholding the gospel of Christ. After the live service on Sunday mornings, our messages remain online and continue to reach thousands of people across the country. During the year 2022, the thumbnail images of our messages, some of which you see here, were displayed to well over 3 million people. As a result, almost 21,000 people viewed our message, showing godless evolution to be false. And more than 80,000 viewed our message on the signs leading up to Christ's return. Our other messages are reaching additional thousands each week. To accomplish that, Bible Nook spent $5,111 during the year. It's a small ministry, but it accomplishes a lot. And most of that money went toward Facebook and Google to boost our messages. During that same time last year, Bible Nook received $4,259 as gifts from 4 couples and 1 individual, with my wife and I making up the $852 additional expenses from our own personal funds. I took no salary from Bible Nook, and neither did anyone else. If the Lord moves your heart to spend some of your resources on this gospel outreach, you can do so by visiting BibleNook.com and clicking the donate button on the home page.
Pastor David Reed has authored numerous books, served as a contributing editor of Dr. Walter Martin's Christian Research Journal, taught at Spurgeon's in London, and pastored Emmanuel Baptist Church in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He now provides these worship services for individuals at home, and free to use by small groups and churches.